They told the world slavery ended with a law. It did not end. It learned how to hide. And before America turned black pain into public amusement, it first had to build a nation that treated black life as expendable. In August 1619, a ship reached Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying more than 20 captured Africans. That was not a footnote. That was an opening crime scene. The men who traded human beings for provisions did not merely begin a labor system. They helped begin an American habit, turning black suffering into profit, then calling the arrangement normal. This is where the record must be corrected. Too often, the story is softened. Schoolbook language makes it sound distant, procedural, almost clean. It was not clean. It was not procedural. It was organized theft of body, labor, name, marriage, language, memory, and future. The violence was not accidental. It was administrative. It was written into law, preached through custom, and enforced by men who wanted wealth without conscience. By 1662, Virginia had already moved to protect that machine. The law declared that a child would follow the condition of the mother. That meant if a black woman was enslaved, her child was born into bondage too. No ambiguity, no mercy. A woman could be violated, and the law would not recognize a victim. It would recognize an asset. That was the moral architecture being built in plain sight. By 1705, Virginia's slave codes had hardened the system further. Black people could be treated as property under law. In 1724, Louisiana's racial order added another layer of control. In 1740, South Carolina tightened the screws again after rebellion terrified white power. This was not a few cruel men behaving badly. This was a civilization writing cruelty into its foundations and teaching itself to call that order. The plantation did not only take labor, it took personhood. A black man could not testify freely against a white person. A black woman had no legal shield over her body. Families could be broken with a signature, a debt, a sale, or a whim. Marriage meant little if an owner decided otherwise. A child could be sold south. A mother could be sent away. A father could watch and do nothing because the system was designed to make him powerless in front of his own blood. That was the point. The system did not merely want obedience. It wanted humiliation. It wanted to train people to live with terror so constantly that even silence felt dangerous. Imagine Elias Carter, a fictional boy born in 1848 on a plantation outside Natchez, Mississippi. He is not a symbol. He stands in for thousands whose names were never preserved because the archive cared more about cotton tallies than black childhood. Elias learns early what white order requires. Keep your eyes lowered. Do not speak unless called. Do not run. Do not ask where your sister went after the wagon took her. Do not ask why your mother's face changes when the master walks toward the cabin after dark. Do not ask why grown men go quiet when the overseer carries a whip. Children in slavery learned fear the way other children learn weather. It was always there. Formerly enslaved people later described work that began before daylight and ended after dark. Pregnant women in the fields. Children punished for slowing down, for dropping tools, for looking distracted, for being children in a system that profited from denying childhood itself. This was not occasional abuse interrupting a work routine. Terror was the routine. Violence was part of the schedule. And because the nation wanted the profits, it accepted the method. When Frederick Douglass, born in February 1818 in Maryland, recalled seeing his Aunt Hester whipped until blood ran down her back, he was describing more than a personal memory. He was identifying the ceremony by which slavery introduced itself to black children. Not through argument, through fear, through spectacle, through the deliberate lesson that pain would be public and protection would be absent. That lesson mattered. Because a system like this cannot survive on chains alone. It needs theater, it needs witnesses, it needs repeated demonstrations of who may suffer and who may watch. By the late 18th century and into the 19th, plantation wealth expanded through tobacco, rice, sugar, and then cotton. After the cotton gin transformed production in 1793, the appetite grew even larger. Between 1790 and 1860, American cotton production exploded. That wealth was celebrated as innovation, enterprise, expansion. But beneath every triumphant number stood bodies bent under surveillance, hunger, punishment, and exhaustion. American capitalism did not rise above slavery. It fed on it. By 1860, nearly 4 million enslaved people were living in the United States. Their combined monetary value was staggering, bigger than railroads, bigger than factories, bigger than the moral vocabulary of the country that claimed liberty while calculating the market price of black children. That contradiction should not be described gently. It was not hypocrisy at the margins. It was the center of the structure. And still, enslaved people resisted. They slowed work, broke tools, preserved memory, escaped when they could. Some fought openly. Gabriel Prosser in 1800, Denmark Vesey in 1822, Nat Turner in 1831. These names matter because they break the lie that slavery reduced everyone to passivity. No, resistance was constant, but so was retaliation. Turner's rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia was answered with sweeping vengeance, killing many black people who had nothing to do with the uprising. White America did not merely fear revolt. It used that fear to justify even harsher control. That is how systems of domination behave. They create the wound, then blame the wounded for bleeding. And now we come to the great American deception. People say 1865 as if it closed the matter. They say the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, and pretend a door shut forever. But law is one thing, habit is another, appetite is another. A nation that had spent centuries disciplining itself to enjoy black subordination was not going to surrender that appetite because a constitutional amendment demanded better behavior. It would adapt. It would move from plantation to debt, from overseer to badge, from slave code to black code, from whip to public ritual, from ownership to humiliation. That is the truth this story intends to expose, because what came later did not emerge from nowhere. The post-war spectacles, the staged degradations, the rituals of laughter around black pain, they were not a break from slavery. They were slavery's afterlife. The crowd changed clothes. The logic did not change. So when we talk about what happened to black boys and black men in the decades that followed, we must begin here, in the architecture of the original crime. At the dock in 1619, in the legal poison of 1662, in the codes of 1705 and 1740, in the cotton hunger after 1793, in the blood-soaked economy of 1860, in the false comfort of 1865, that is where the trap was built. And that is why remembering matters, not as ceremony, not as performance, but as correction. A society that refuses to name its crimes will always find new language to excuse them. A society that forgets how cruelty was normalized will eventually mistake that cruelty for culture. If you're listening from a place that still believes memory matters, comment your city and country below. Let the record show exactly where this truth is still being heard. Built from the uploaded scripts timeline of 1865 to 1877, including Reconstruction, Hiram Revels in 1870, the Colfax Massacre of 1873, and the Compromise of 1877. On December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified. America announced slavery was over. The country congratulated itself with the language of law, as if a constitutional sentence could wash out 2.5 centuries of organized theft. But paper is cheap, power is not. What ended in law did not end in practice. It changed shape, changed clothes, changed vocabulary. The plantation did not vanish. It learned how to speak through sheriffs, judges, landlords, rail cars, ballots, and mobs. That is the truth this nation kept trying to bury beneath ceremony. For a brief and dangerous moment, the old order cracked. Between 1865 and 1877, during Reconstruction, black men across the South entered public life with a seriousness white supremacy had always feared. They voted, they held office, they built schools and churches. They tried to make citizenship mean something more than a word spoken by white men over black graves. In 1870, Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black United States Senator. In South Carolina, black political participation reshaped the legislature itself. For a moment, the impossible stood in daylight, formerly enslaved people acting like citizens because they were citizens. And that, to the defeated planter class and its allies, was intolerable. Let us stop pretending the backlash was confusion or growing pains. It was counterattack, deliberate, coordinated. Moral failure dressed up as local custom. White power did not misunderstand Reconstruction. It understood it perfectly. That is why it moved so quickly to destroy it. Take a fictional witness like Elias Carter, now 17 years old in 1865 in Adams County, Mississippi. He has survived bondage long enough to hear a new word repeated in church and in whispers outside the fields. Freedom. He watches older black men stand straighter. He watches his mother, Naomi Carter, speak a little louder when white men pass. He watches a teacher from the North arrive with a box of books and the dangerous idea that black children should learn to read the laws that had been written against them. He watches a voter registration line form where once there had only been auction lines and work lines and punishment lines, and then he watches the retaliation begin, because freedom in the South was never opposed with argument alone. It was opposed with theater and fear. The old masters had lost one legal weapon, so they built new ones. First came the Black Codes, passed in the immediate aftermath of the war in states across the former Confederacy. Mississippi moved early in 1865. These laws did not openly restore slavery because they understood the new rules well enough to avoid saying the old word. Instead, they restricted movement, labor, contracts, vagrancy, weapons, testimony, and assembly. The method was familiar. If you cannot openly own black people, trap them. If you cannot sell them, criminalize them. If you cannot call them slaves, make their freedom punishable. That was the invention. Not freedom denied outright, but freedom surrounded. A black man without proof of employment could be arrested. A black family without land could be pushed into labor contracts they did not control. A child without protection could be forced into apprenticeship arrangements that looked too much like bondage to be mistaken for anything else. The state had discovered a new talent, preserving domination while pretending to obey the Constitution. And behind the law stood men who understood that statutes alone would not be enough. They needed terror to complete the work. So names began to multiply. Ku Klux Klan, White League, Red Shirts. These were not mysterious outbursts of anger. They were political instruments. Night riders with a social function, assassination crews for white democracy. Their job was simple. Make black voting dangerous. Make black organizing expensive. Make black confidence punishable. Make white rule feel inevitable again. A fictional county sheriff like Warren Pike in Louisiana, 1872, does not need to wear a hood himself. Men like him rarely needed to. He only needs to look away at the right time, delay an arrest, misplace a statement, call a massacre a disturbance, mark black testimony as doubtful and white violence as regrettable. That is how institutional evil often operates, not always with a scream, often with paperwork, delay, and a carefully cultivated absence of conscience. Then came Easter Sunday, April 13, 1873, in Colfax, Louisiana. The Colfax Massacre stands as one of Reconstruction's clearest indictments. After a disputed election, armed white supremacists attacked black defenders gathered at the courthouse. The fighting ended. Surrender came. And still the killing continued. Historians estimate around 150 black men were killed. Many were not killed in battle at all, but after resistance had collapsed. That is not a riot. It is not confusion. It is not two sides. It is a message written in bodies. This region will not tolerate black political power, and law will not save you. That message traveled fast. It reached church steps in Mississippi. It reached cabins in Alabama. It reached freedmen's schools in South Carolina. It reached boys like Elias Carter, who by 1873 is old enough to understand what adults try not to say in front of children. A ballot can get you buried, and the nation may not care enough to notice. This is where the moral fraud of the era becomes impossible to ignore. America praised itself for abolition, then watched as black citizens were hunted for trying to use the rights they had supposedly been given. The distance between principle and practice was not an accident. It was the system. Reconstruction was sabotaged not because it failed naturally, but because white power treated black progress as a threat requiring organized punishment. And punishment came from every direction. Teachers were attacked, ministers were threatened, black office holders were targeted. Families who tried to buy land found themselves cheated, burned out, or driven off. White newspapers fed the mood with lies about corruption, incompetence, and racial disorder, as if democracy itself had become unnatural the moment black men participated in it. This is how reaction always speaks. It calls equality chaos. It calls cruelty restoration. It calls domination peace. By 1875 and 1876, the pressure was mounting. Federal resolve was weakening. Northern fatigue was growing. Too many white Americans wanted reunion with the South more than justice for the people the South had brutalized. Reconciliation in this country has often meant asking black people to carry the cost of white comfort. Reconstruction was no exception. Then came the betrayal that completed the transition. In 1877, under the Compromise of 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. That decision is often described in restrained language as if it were merely political negotiation at the end of a contested election. It was more than that. It was abandonment. It signaled to white supremacist governments that the last meaningful barrier had been removed. Black citizenship would now be defended, if at all, by local structures already saturated with hostility. From that point forward, the descent accelerated. Jim Crow would harden. Voting rights would be stripped with taxes, tests, clauses, tricks, and force. Segregation would be codified. Public humiliation would become ordinary. The mob and the courthouse would begin speaking the same language. What slavery had done through ownership, the post-war South would do through exclusion, criminalization, debt, and spectacle. Elias Carter, by 1877, is 29 years old. He has lived long enough to watch emancipation announced and then fenced in. He has seen a schoolhouse open and then burn. He has seen a registrar accept black names and then armed men arrive after dark. He has seen grown men whisper again the way they whispered before 1865. Not because freedom was false, but because freedom without protection is a trap. Freedom without enforcement is bait. Freedom without memory is propaganda. And that is the lesson that must be spoken plainly. The years after slavery were not a clean dawn. They were a violent negotiation in which white America showed again and again that it would rather sabotage democracy than share it. Reconstruction did not fail because black citizens were unready. Reconstruction was attacked because black citizens were ready, and that readiness exposed the moral poverty of the people determined to rule them forever. The chains had been broken in law. So the country built new instruments. Not because it forgot what slavery was, because too many people missed what slavery gave them. By the late 1880s, the South had already made its decision. Black freedom would not be accepted as citizenship. It would be reduced, cornered, and publicly humiliated until it looked like submission again. That is the world in which the so-called Negro battle royal emerged, not as an odd sideshow, not as an isolated cruelty, but as a ritual shaped by the same old appetite, white comfort fed by black suffering. The file makes that pattern unmistakable, tracing how these events appeared across Southern civic life by the 1890s and early 1900s, especially in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and Arkansas. This matters because language has often been used to soften the crime. Entertainment, exhibition, sport. Those words were camouflage. They disguised coercion as amusement and turned the moral collapse of a region into local custom. The battle royal was never about competition. It was about instruction. It taught white audiences that black pain could be consumed without guilt. It taught black boys that even survival might require them to injure one another in front of people who already considered them less than human. Take Isaiah Cole, a fictional black laborer from East Texas, born in 1891, the son of a sharecropping family that had never truly escaped the reach of plantation logic. By 1908, he is 17 years old. Thin from poor harvests, undereducated because the school season is cut short by field work, already familiar with debt, already familiar with white men speaking about him as if he is standing somewhere outside the category of citizen. He has not been invited to anything in his life that carried good intentions. So when a local foreman tells him there is money to be made at the county fair in October 1908, Isaiah does not hear opportunity. He hears danger wearing a friendly face. He is right. The battle royal did not need a formal rulebook. It needed a setting, a crowd, and a black body with too little power to refuse. The setting varied: a fairground in Texas, a civic banquet in Mississippi, a lodge hall in Alabama, a barn on the edge of town. A fenced ring near a boxing exhibition. The details changed. The structure did not. Young black men, usually teenagers or men in their early 20s, were brought in, sometimes by employers, sometimes by local officials, sometimes by men promising cash, work, or favor. Then the performance began. In 1898, a report from the Dallas Morning News described a battle royal during a civic celebration in Texas where black boys were made to fight until one remained standing. The tone was not outraged. It was amused. That cold detail matters. The event was not hidden because it did not need to be hidden. White society had already decided what counted as scandal and what counted as fun, and black suffering fell too easily into the second category. By 1904, similar events were being reported in Mississippi county fairs. Black youths were blindfolded and forced to strike at one another while white crowds laughed at their confusion. That laughter is one of the ugliest details in this entire history, not because it was loud, but because it was ordinary. Ordinary laughter, casual laughter. The kind that reveals a conscience has already been trained to step aside. Now picture the room more clearly. The men in attendance are merchants, sheriffs, small-town politicians, planters, bankers, railroad men, store owners. Their wives are present. Their children are present. Food is on the table. Liquor is being poured. The mood is social, almost festive. Someone announces the special amusement. A handful of black boys are let in. They do not enter as guests. They enter as material. Isaiah stands beside 3 others. One is Leon Booker, fictional, 19, broad-shouldered, hands scarred from timber work. Another is Caleb Reed, fictional, 16, hired out seasonally from a farm outside Shreveport, Louisiana. The youngest is Thomas Bell, fictional, barely 15, still carrying the uncertain posture of a child who has been ordered too many times by too many men. They are handed gloves in some places, in others, nothing. Sometimes they are blindfolded, sometimes the ring is surrounded by wires or rough barriers to keep them confined. Sometimes the crowd throws coins onto the ground afterward, forcing the bleeding boys to scramble for money like starving animals under the eyes of people calling themselves civilized. And that is the point that must be stated without politeness. This was civilization revealing its real face. The old plantation had relied on the overseer's whip. The post-Reconstruction South discovered it could achieve a similar lesson with applause. Humiliation became communal. Violence became participatory. Men did not have to own black bodies anymore to feel entitled to stage them. Ownership had shifted into culture. A white organizer in Jackson, Mississippi, 1902, fictionalized here as Councilman Horace Bell, does not need to give a political speech to defend white supremacy. He only needs to host one of these events and let the room do the rest. He lets children watch black teenagers collide under blindfolds. He lets respectable women smile from the tables. He lets wagers circulate. He lets the lesson settle deep. Black fear is entertainment, black injury is disposable, and white society can gather around that fact without shame. That is how systems survive, not merely through law, but through rehearsal. The battle royal was one of those rehearsals. Every blow carried a message. Not just to the fighters, but to the entire community watching. To black families, your sons are never safe from being turned into spectacle. To white boys in the audience, this is what power looks like when no one stops it. To local officials, no prosecution is needed because no one important intends to complain. To the nation at large, the end of slavery changed the language, not the impulse. A report from Texas in 1908 described one such event as a roaring success, praising the lively scrap put on by black participants. That kind of wording should not be read passively. It is evidence. Evidence of a press culture willing to transform coercion into cheerful copy. Evidence of a society that could look directly at staged humiliation and call it community amusement. Newspapers did not merely record these rituals, they normalized them. Meanwhile, black families understood the danger in whispers. Mothers warned sons not to linger near fairs after dark. Fathers measured every exchange with white employers for hidden threats. Older men remembered the auction block and recognized the same design in this new performance. The clothes were different, the stage was different, the intention was not. Isaiah's mother, Sarah Cole, fictional, knows this before her son does. When he leaves for the fairground, she notices the way the foreman avoids her eyes. That is enough. In the South, the smallest gestures often carried the worst news. She waits through the evening beside a dim lamp, knowing that poor black families in 1908 Texas did not possess the protection of law, money, or public sympathy. They possessed dread, memory, and prayer, and sometimes not even enough of the last one. Hours later, Isaiah returns with a split lip, one eye swelling shut, and dust ground into his clothes. He says little. Most survivors did. Trauma does not always announce itself with speeches. Sometimes it enters a room quietly and stays for decades. He remembers not the first hit, not even the pain, but the sound around it. The laughter, the cheering, the betting, the way grown white men barked instructions as if they were directing farm animals. The way even the children clapped. That memory is historically consistent with what oral accounts later described. Men forced into these events often recalled the humiliation more sharply than the physical blows, because humiliation was the deeper wound, pain heals unevenly. Degradation rearranges the self, and the battle royal was designed to do exactly that. It forced black men into conflict with one another while the system that cornered them stood untouched outside the ring. That structure was not random. It echoed slavery with disturbing precision. Under slavery, black families were split, ranked, sold, and punished to preserve control. In the battle royal, black survival again depended on hurting someone equally trapped. The white crowd did not simply witness division. It engineered it, rewarded it, and laughed over it. This is why it is wrong to treat the battle royal as a vulgar form of early boxing. Boxing recognizes opponents as athletes. The battle royal recognized black boys as props. One belonged to sport, the other belonged to domination. By 1911, versions of these events were still appearing in parts of the South. Some were attached to county fairs, others to private gatherings or civic clubs. Not all were recorded, and that absence should not comfort anyone. Much of racial terror went underdocumented precisely because the institutions keeping records did not think black suffering deserved careful preservation. Silence in the archive is not innocence. Often it is complicity. So when we examine this ritual, we are not looking at a grotesque footnote. We are looking at a society confessing itself, a society announcing that black bodies could still be ordered into performance long after emancipation, a society proving that public cruelty does not require monsters in secret rooms. It only requires enough ordinary people willing to call degradation tradition, and that is the lesson worth carrying forward with some moral clarity. Evil does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it comes laughing, well-dressed, seated at a banquet table, applauding while boys are ordered to bleed for the room. The battle royal did not appear in a vacuum. A society does not gather to laugh at black boys bleeding unless it has already trained itself to treat black life as cheap. That training was not abstract. It lived in rent ledgers, crop contracts, prison records, school budgets, railroad cars, courtrooms, and cabins with dirt floors. By the 1890s, the South had rebuilt domination so thoroughly that freedom often looked like a word printed on paper while punishment controlled daily life. This is where the lie becomes impossible to ignore. After slavery ended in 1865, the nation congratulated itself too quickly. What followed was not repair. It was redesign. The whip lost its legal name. The system kept its purpose. Black families across Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas were pushed into sharecropping and tenant farming, arrangements sold as opportunity but structured as entrapment. White landowners offered land, seed, tools, and supplies on credit. At harvest, they claimed most of the crop and charged interest so severe that many black families never cleared the debt. A good year barely kept hunger away. A bad year made escape nearly impossible. That is not free labor. That is captivity with bookkeeping. Take Sarah Cole, fictional, living with her son Isaiah in East Texas in 1909, 1 year after he is dragged into a battle royal. She wakes before dawn, counts flour by the handful, and waits for a merchant's ledger she already knows has been designed against her. The family grows cotton on land they do not own, buys food from a store they do not control, and settles accounts with a man who writes the numbers and never has to prove they are honest. That is how post-slavery power worked. It did not always need chains around ankles. It preferred numbers on paper and hunger in the kitchen. The crop lien system became one of the South's cleanest crimes because it looked respectable. Men in jackets and ledgers replaced men with auction blocks, but the result was familiar. Black labor extracted, black mobility restricted, black futures mortgaged to white profit. Whole families worked to stay in place. Children were pulled from school when cotton needed picking. Women labored through pregnancy. Men bent under debt they had no realistic way to pay off because the debt itself was part of the design. And when debt was not enough, the state supplied another weapon. By the 1870s, 1880s, and into the early 1900s, Southern states built up convict leasing systems that turned criminal law into a pipeline back to forced labor. Black men were arrested for vagrancy, loitering, speaking out of turn, lacking employment papers, or whatever else local officials needed to invent. Then they were leased to private employers, mines, farms, railroads, lumber camps, under conditions often worse than slavery because leased men were easier to replace than purchased ones. An owner had once held a financial interest in keeping an enslaved person alive. A leaseholder often had no such restraint. That is the kind of detail polite histories like to soften. They should not. In Alabama, by the 1890s, leased convicts were dying at staggering rates. In some camps, mortality became part of the operating cost. Men were starved, beaten, worked through illness, chained, and buried with little notice. Their names disappeared into records that cared more about output than human remains. The state did not merely fail to stop this, It profited from it. Government and industry met each other over black suffering and called the arrangement practical. A fictional man like Caleb Reed, arrested in Birmingham in 1897 for vagrancy after leaving a job site where wages had been withheld, would have known the trick immediately if he had the luxury of thinking in legal terms. But terror rarely announces itself as theory. It arrives as a deputy, a false charge, a local judge, and then a labor contract signed over your body without your consent. That is how freedom was narrowed until it resembled a corridor with armed men at both ends. The chain gang followed the same logic. By the early 20th century, black prisoners were marched in public, shackled together, building roads and working fields under guard. This was labor, yes, but it was also theater. The South wanted black bodies seen under control. Public punishment reassured white audiences that hierarchy still stood. The end of slavery had unsettled them. Chain gangs restored the visual grammar of domination, and while men were dragged through courts and camps, black women carried a double burden the nation has too often treated as secondary. They endured racial subjugation and sexual vulnerability at the same time. In fields, kitchens, laundries, and white households, black women worked under constant exposure to coercion, accusation, and exploitation. Their labor was expected. Their pain was discounted. Their daughters were made to grow up too fast in a society that denied them childhood and then blamed them for the damage. So when we speak of the post-slavery South, we should refuse the old habit of isolating men's suffering from women's. The system was total. It pressed on fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters with different methods but one purpose: keep black life unstable, frightened, poor, and available for use. Housing made that purpose visible. Across the rural South in the 1890s and 1900s, black families often lived in one-room shacks with poor roofing, no insulation, no plumbing, and little protection from heat or cold. Families slept close because there was no space. Children coughed through damp nights. Illness moved easily. Privacy barely existed. The nation spoke of order while making black domestic life precarious by design. Food told the same story. Diets built around cornmeal, molasses, fatback, beans, and greens were not culinary traditions in any noble sense here. They were survival formulas under scarcity. Meat was limited. Fresh milk was often unavailable. Malnutrition was common. Disease traveled with poverty. Tuberculosis, hookworm, pellagra, these were not just medical facts. They were evidence of a public order that accepted black deterioration as ordinary. By 1900, black infant mortality remained catastrophically high. That number should be read as a moral document, not a statistic. A society that allows infants to die at such rates while celebrating its progress is not confused. It is making a choice about whose suffering counts. Then there was education, forever advertised as available, rarely funded as if black minds mattered. In many southern states by 1910, white students received several times the public funding given to black students. Schools for black children often ran only a few months a year because the labor system wanted their hands in the fields. One teacher might be responsible for dozens of pupils. Buildings were underheated, undersupplied, and overcrowded. Books arrived late, damaged, or not at all. Yet white officials still had the nerve to speak of uplift, as though black communities were failing themselves rather than being systematically denied the tools of advancement. That hypocrisy deserves to be called what it was: a moral fraud wrapped in administrative language. The law completed the enclosure. In 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson gave federal blessing to segregation under the poisonous doctrine of separate but equal. It was never equal. Everyone knew that. The phrase was a legal costume draped over theft. Separate schools, separate rail cars, separate hospitals, separate waiting rooms, separate cemeteries, every division announcing the same message: black Americans would be allowed near the nation only on terms designed to remind them of their assigned place. And beneath segregation ran the constant threat of sudden punishment, looking too long at a white man, speaking too confidently, failing to step aside on a sidewalk, arguing over wages, defending a family member, owning a little too much land. Succeeding a little too visibly. Any of it could trigger a beating, an arrest, a disappearance, or a gathering that called itself justice while behaving like vengeance. This is why the battle royal must never be treated as a bizarre exception. It belonged to this wider machinery, sharecropping trapped black families economically. Convict leasing trapped black men through criminal law. Segregation trapped black movement in public space. Underfunded schools trapped black children in manufactured disadvantage. And the battle royal trapped black dignity in a ring then sold tickets to the humiliation. Each piece strengthened the others. A boy like Isaiah Cole did not step into that ring as a free individual who happened to be unlucky. He stepped into it as the product of a region that had already stripped his family of land, his school of resources, his labor of fair value, and his community of legal protection. The crowd at the fair did not invent cruelty that night. It consumed a cruelty already normalized by farms, jails, courthouses, and statehouses. That is what makes this history so damning. The South did not merely preserve white supremacy through occasional brutality. It organized daily life so thoroughly around black vulnerability that public amusement built from black pain could seem natural to people who went to church the next morning and called themselves decent. Decency, in such a world, was often just another mask. And that is the lesson worth holding on to with uncomfortable clarity. When a society teaches itself to ignore deprivation, it will eventually learn to enjoy degradation. The road from the sharecropper's cabin to the battle royal ring was not long. It was built on purpose. In 1892, Ida B. Wells looked at America without flinching and named the crime for what it was. That year, after the killing of her friends Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart in Memphis, Tennessee, she began exposing the lie that white mobs were defending virtue or law. They were not. They were defending power. They were punishing black ambition, black success, black dignity, and any sign that black people intended to live as full human beings in a country built on denying exactly that. That is where this story must go next, because the battle royal was never only about fists. It was about narrative. It was about forcing black people into roles white society had already written for them: brute, fool, target, body, warning. And whenever a black man or black boy tried to step outside that script, the system moved fast to drag him back inside it. Ida B. Wells understood that better than most. In the 1890s, while newspapers across the South printed excuses for mob violence, Wells was gathering facts. She was documenting cases. She was dismantling the favorite alibi of white terror, the accusation that black men were naturally dangerous and that white violence was merely defensive. She showed again and again that the accusations were often false, exaggerated, or manufactured after the fact. The real triggers were often economic competition, political confidence, labor disputes, land ownership, and the unforgivable offense of refusing submission. That matters here because the battle royal fed on the same mythology. White America spent the late 19th century inventing the black male as a threat and then staging rituals to prove its own lie. It portrayed black men as dangerous in newspapers, speeches, and rumor. Then it forced black boys into public violence and pointed to the spectacle as confirmation of their supposed savagery. This was not contradiction, it was design. First invent the monster. Then force the victim to perform the role. Then call the performance evidence. Consider Daniel Price, fictional, born in 1894 near Montgomery, Alabama. By 1910 he is 16, thin, bright, and known in his local church for reading aloud with unusual confidence. He has learned enough from older people to know that confidence is dangerous when worn in white view. He keeps his voice low in town, lowers his eyes at the wrong moments, and understands that in Alabama, a black boy could be accused of arrogance simply for sounding educated. One evening in 1910, Daniel is taken by his employer to a local gathering. He is told there will be a chance to earn $2. That amount matters. $2 can mean meal flour, lamp oil, maybe a doctor visit postponed too long. Poor black families did not evaluate danger the way safer people do. Hunger rearranged choice. Debt rearranged risk. That is one of the system's oldest tricks. Create desperation, then pretend consent exists. At the gathering, Daniel finds 3 other black youths waiting. One is older, already bruised from mill work. One looks no older than 15. Another cannot stop glancing toward the doorway as if escape might still be possible. The crowd is white. The room is loud. Men are drinking. Women are smiling politely in that terrible way respectable society often smiles when it has decided someone else's pain is not its concern. Daniel understands the trap 1 second too late. A blindfold is tied. Gloves are shoved into hands. Voices shout. Laughter rises before the first strike lands. This is the point where history must be read with moral honesty. The worst thing in that room is not only the blows, it is the audience. A society that can watch confused teenagers strike at one another for amusement is not merely prejudiced. It is corrupted at the level of instinct. It has trained its conscience to retreat whenever black suffering enters the room. Daniel swings because he cannot see and because someone hits him first. He stumbles over another body. He hears a boy crying out. Hears white men laugh harder. Hears a voice call for them to keep going. When it ends, the winner does not look victorious. He looks emptied out. Blood, dust, shame, applause. Then coins are thrown down. The room wants one more scene. It always wants one more scene. That structure would later be immortalized in 1952, when Ralph Ellison opened Invisible Man with one of the most disturbing sequences in American fiction. A young black boy invited to deliver a speech before white civic leaders, only to be forced into a blindfolded battle royal first. After the humiliation, after the confusion, after the degradation, he is finally permitted to speak. Ellison was not inventing cruelty for dramatic effect. He was exposing a national formula. Before a black boy could be heard, he had to be reduced. Before intellect, humiliation. Before recognition, injury. Before words, blood. That was the lesson. Ellison, born in 1913 in Oklahoma City, grew up close enough to this world to know its language. The battle royal in Invisible Man works because it is not just symbolic. It is historically grounded. It reflects what older black generations knew in their bones, that white power often demanded performance before granting even the appearance of attention. A black youth could be invited to impress, but first he had to be broken into entertainment. That is the meaning too many readers miss when they treat the scene as metaphor alone. It was metaphor, yes, but it was also memory. It condensed decades of racial ritual into one room. The crowd, the command, the forced conflict, the mock prize, the false ceremony of opportunity. It showed how black achievement in America was so often staged under conditions designed to humiliate the achiever. And that pattern did not end with fiction. It did not end with the decline of public battle royals in the 1920s and 1930s. The mechanism survived. It moved from fairgrounds to institutions, from barns to banquet halls, from open brutality to polished expectation. Black Americans were still required to endure degradation, suspicion, and impossible tests before being considered worthy of ordinary respect. That is why Ida B. Wells and Ralph Ellison belong in the same moral frame. Wells exposed the lie that black suffering was justified. Ellison exposed the ritual that made black suffering consumable. Wells took apart the public excuse. Ellison took apart the public performance. One showed the machinery from the outside. The other showed what it felt like inside the ring. Between them stands a whole generation of black boys like Daniel Price or Isaiah Cole, or thousands of real boys whose names were never preserved because white institutions documented the spectacle more carefully than the victims. They were not simply beaten, they were instructed that their bodies were public property, instructed that white laughter could cancel black pain, instructed that survival might depend on swallowing humiliation without losing the will to live. And yet the deeper accusation belongs not only to the men who organized these events, or to the sheriffs who ignored them, or to the editors who joked about them in print. It belongs also to the respectable classes who attended, smiled, and went home unchanged. White supremacy did not survive on open brutality alone. It relied on clean hands in dirty rooms. It relied on decent clothes, church attendance, dinner tables, civic committees, and people who preferred comfort to conscience. That is what should disturb us most. Not that monsters existed, they always do. It is that ordinary society made room for them, applauded them, and called the evening a success. By the time Invisible Man appeared in 1952, the public battle royal had largely faded from view. But the logic had not faded. America was still asking black people to perform endurance under pressure, to prove worth through suffering, to remain composed while moving through rooms built to deny their full humanity. The script had become more polished. It had not become more moral, and that is why memory must stay sharp here. If a nation forgets the rituals that trained it to laugh at humiliation, it will keep mistaking those rituals for harmless tradition. If it forgets how black pain was staged, consumed, and normalized, it will fail to recognize the newer stages when they appear. The battle royal was never only about violence. It was about permission to degrade. Permission to enjoy degradation. Permission to call degradation culture. A country that grants that permission should never be trusted to tell its own story gently. By the 1920s and 1930s, the public battle royal began to recede from open view. Not because the South had found a conscience. Not because white power suddenly recognized black humanity. It faded for harder, colder reasons. The country was changing shape. The Great Migration carried more than 1.6 million black Americans out of the South between 1916 and 1930. Black newspapers widened the circle of exposure. Activists had spent decades naming what polite society tried to excuse. 2 world wars forced the nation to hear, however reluctantly, the contradiction between black military service and black subjugation at home. Public rituals of humiliation did not become unthinkable. They became less convenient to stage so openly. That distinction matters. A cruelty does not become less evil because it learns discretion. Take Isaiah Cole, now an older man by 1932, living far from the fairground where he was once dragged into a ring in Texas. He is no longer the hungry teenager who stumbled under blindfold and laughter. He has a wife now, a daughter. A son named Jeremiah Cole, fictional, born in 1918. Isaiah does not describe that night often. Men like him were not offered the luxury of public testimony. There were no commissions waiting for them, no reparations office. No court eager to hear how county respectability had been built on staged degradation. The country preferred silence because silence protected too many reputations. That is one of the dirtiest features of this history. The disappearance of the ritual was mistaken for the disappearance of the logic, but the logic remained. What was the battle royal, stripped of its props? It was the conversion of black vulnerability into white reassurance. It was the staging of domination so a crowd could feel hierarchy in its bones. It was the public consumption of black suffering as proof that the social order still held. Remove the ring, remove the blindfold, remove the county fair, and the structure still survives if the culture continues to reward humiliation, excuse indifference, and call black pain ordinary. That survival can be traced through the decades. In September 1944 in Abbeville, Alabama, Reese Taylor was abducted and assaulted by 6 white men. They confessed. No one was held accountable. Rosa Parks, years before the bus boycott made her internationally known in 1955, helped investigate the case. That episode belongs in this story because it proves the central point. Even when the spectacle changed, the system's message did not. Black bodies remained exposed to power without protection. Black suffering remained negotiable. White institutions remained deeply practiced in the art of looking away. Then came 1952 and Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which placed the battle royal in the front hall of American literature. That scene did not preserve the past like a museum relic. It carried the old ritual into modern consciousness because the old ritual had not actually died. Ellison understood that humiliation had become portable. It could move from fairgrounds into classrooms, workplaces, courtrooms, and civic ceremonies. It could survive wherever black intelligence was welcomed only after black submission, wherever achievement was celebrated only after degradation had already done its work. So when people say the battle royal disappeared, the answer should be precise. The costume changed. By the 1950s and 1960s, the nation began congratulating itself again. School desegregation rulings, civil rights legislation, televised speeches about justice. The official story moved toward redemption because redemption is easier to market than continuity. But the machinery beneath daily black life did not vanish, it adjusted. The courthouse learned new language. The police department inherited old assumptions. Housing policy redrew exclusion through maps instead of chains. Schools remained divided by district lines and money. Employment discrimination survived behind interviews, referrals, and qualifications. The prison population would later explode under laws advertised as neutral while falling with devastating force on black communities. That is not drift. It is adaptation. Consider Jeremiah Cole in 1968, Isaiah's son, a veteran recently home, still carrying the discipline the country demanded from him overseas. He has worn the uniform. He has saluted the flag. He has done everything the nation says earns dignity. Yet in his hometown he is still followed in stores, spoken to with measured contempt, and reminded that service does not cancel color. He has inherited his father's silence and his father's lesson. America often asks black men to prove loyalty to a system that still reserves the right to degrade them. By the 1970s and 1980s, the public appetite for explicit racial spectacle had become less socially acceptable in polite speech, but the deeper appetite did not disappear. It migrated into coded politics, crime panics, distorted media narratives, and the relentless association of blackness with danger. The same culture that once packed fairgrounds to watch coerced violence now consumed headlines, mugshots, courtroom theater, and television segments that transformed black communities into a permanent source of fear and fascination. Again, the structure stayed familiar. First, construct black life as disorder. Then, build institutions around controlling that disorder. Then, present the resulting control as public safety. Then consume the consequences as normal. That is the battle royal translated into policy. By the 1990s and 2000s, surveillance expanded, incarceration deepened, and a new kind of spectacle emerged. It was no longer always local, and it was no longer always contained in a single room. Technology widened the audience. News cycles accelerated the replay. Black injury, black death, black panic, black grief. These could now circulate across screens, endlessly watched, debated, slowed down, reframed, and monetized. The crowd was no longer gathered around a ring in Texas or Mississippi. It was dispersed, networked, and still disturbingly ready to consume suffering before confronting the system that produced it. This is where moral language becomes necessary. A nation can pass laws and still preserve appetite. It can condemn old rituals while inventing newer ones. It can point to history as if history were dead while reenacting its emotional grammar in real time. The battle royal was never sustained by one venue or one decade. It was sustained by a habit of feeling, the habit of treating black pain as usable. Once that habit is embedded deeply enough, it does not require a barn, a banquet hall, or a county fair. It only requires institutions that keep black life precarious and audiences trained to mistake exposure for understanding. That is why forgetting is so dangerous. Forget the battle royal, and the modern world begins to look disconnected. Police violence becomes a series of isolated cases. Prison expansion becomes administrative necessity. Poverty becomes personal failure. Viral footage becomes awareness instead of evidence. Forget the older ritual, and the newer ones lose their lineage. They become easier to excuse because they appear accidental. They are not accidental. They belong to a long American tradition of disciplining black existence through visibility, vulnerability, and public interpretation. Under slavery, the body was inspected. Under Jim Crow, it was segregated and exposed. In the era of the battle royal, it was staged. In later decades, it was policed, recorded, replayed, and still too often denied the full shelter of empathy. Different methods, same inheritance. Imagine Malik Cole, fictional, born in 1998, the great-grandson of Isaiah. He knows nothing firsthand of the fairground in 1908. No one in the family speaks of it clearly. But he grows up in a country where black suffering still arrives prepackaged for public consumption. He learns early that a camera can document injustice and still fail to prevent it. He learns that outrage can be brief, that memory can be selective, and that institutions skilled at surviving scandal often wait for the audience to grow tired. That exhaustion is part of the structure too. Power relies on fatigue. The battle royal, then, was never merely a barbaric entertainment from a more openly racist time. It was a blueprint. It showed how domination works when it seeks not only control but participation, not only silence but laughter, not only inequality but performance. It taught a society to gather around black vulnerability and call the gathering normal. That lesson did not stay in the past. It entered the bloodstream of institutions and the reflexes of culture. So no, the ring never truly closed. It widened, it modernized. It found better lighting, cleaner language, and more respectable defenders. And the most dangerous lie America still tells is that a change in costume counts as a change in conscience. They said the cruelty belonged to another century. They said it ended with emancipation in 1865, faded with reform in the 1930s, and died in disgrace sometime before the modern age learned to call itself enlightened. That is the lie. The ritual changed form, but the logic remained. Black suffering made visible. Black dignity made conditional. Black survival turned into a test staged in front of people who called themselves civilized. Look at the pattern, not the costume. In 1908, a black boy like Isaiah Cole could be pushed into a ring in Texas, blindfolded, confused, and ordered to fight while white spectators laughed. By 1952, Ralph Ellison could place that same ritual at the opening of Invisible Man, not as fantasy, but as memory sharpened into literature. By 1968, Isaiah's son, Jeremiah Cole, a fictional veteran returning home in uniform, could still discover that service to the nation did not protect him from humiliation inside it. By the late 20th century, the ring had expanded beyond county fairs and banquet halls. It moved into courts, police encounters, news broadcasts, and public narratives that kept asking black Americans to prove innocence, discipline, gratitude, and restraint under conditions designed to deny them all four. That is why this story cannot be treated as a footnote. The Negro Battle Royal was never just a local barbarity. It was a window into the emotional structure of white supremacy. It revealed what the system needed most, not only obedience but spectacle, not only control but witnesses, not only inequality but performance. A society confident in its own virtue does not gather to enjoy the humiliation of boys. A society does that only after it has trained itself to see cruelty as custom and suffering as entertainment. And that training did not end when the public ring disappeared. By the 1920s and 1930s, some of the old open rituals became less visible. The Great Migration had disrupted rural power in parts of the South. Black newspapers had widened the record. Reformers, ministers, activists, and writers had begun forcing uglier truths into public view. Yet exposure is not the same as repentance. Too often, America did not abandon its habits. It only cleaned up the presentation. The country learned how to hide the ring inside institutions: a judge with a polished voice, a sheriff with a calm face, a newspaper that describes racial terror as disorder, a school board that underfunds black education and then blames black children for falling behind, a city planner who walls off whole neighborhoods and calls it development, a politician who invokes crime while carefully avoiding the word race, a television segment that packages black grief into ratings. None of this is identical to a battle royal, but all of it draws from the same poisoned well: the idea that black vulnerability may be used, managed, displayed, or consumed for someone else's stability. That is the inheritance. Take Malik Cole, fictional, born in 1998, the great-grandson of Isaiah. He never saw the fairground. He never heard the laughter directly. His family does not tell the whole story. Trauma rarely arrives in neat testimony. It leaks through silences, through warnings, through the way older people tense at certain uniforms, certain sirens, certain phrases. Malik grows up in a country that claims to have moved on, yet still teaches him to manage his body in public, lower his voice at the right time, show his hands, stay measured, never look too angry, never move too fast, never give the room an excuse. That is not freedom in full. That is adaptation under surveillance. The old battle royal forced black boys into violence while a white crowd laughed. The modern order often forces black people into visibility while the public debates whether the suffering was justified. The terms have changed. The appetite has not. Cameras replace banquet halls. Commentators replace gamblers. Viral clips replace county gossip. But the structure remains unnervingly familiar. Black pain enters the public sphere, the audience gathers, and empathy competes with spectacle, and spectacle too often wins. That is the moral center of this history. White supremacy has never been only a legal order. It has also been an aesthetic order, a way of seeing, arranging, and consuming human beings. Under slavery, black bodies were inspected, priced, and worked. Under Jim Crow, they were segregated, policed, and exposed. In the era of the battle royal, they were staged. In later eras, they were criminalized, televised, monitored, and debated. Different technologies. Same basic permission: that black life may be made public in ways white life rarely is. A nation that trains itself this way does not easily recover its conscience. That is why memory matters more than ceremony. Ceremony allows people to feel reverent for a moment and unchanged the next day. Memory, real memory, is harder. It demands connection. It demands that the past not be locked in a museum while the present repeats its grammar in a cleaner accent. The battle royal matters because it forces an ugly question. When exactly did the culture stop rewarding black humiliation? Did it stop in 1910, in 1930, in 1952, in 1968? Or did it simply become more selective, more respectable, more skilled at disguising appetite as commentary, concern, security, or tradition? That question should not be avoided. It should be pressed. Because this history is not only about what white mobs did, or what sheriffs permitted, or what local papers joked about. It is also about what ordinary people tolerated. The wives who stayed seated. The fathers who brought sons to watch. The editors who smiled through their copy. The officials who shrugged. The preachers who said little. The citizens who considered themselves decent because they did not throw the first blow, even as they made peace with the room where the blows were ordered. That is how cruelty survives, not just through monsters, but through audiences. And if there is a quieter moral lesson here, it is this. A people who refuse to examine what they once found entertaining will never fully understand what they still excuse. The battle royal was not sustained by rage alone. It was sustained by enjoyment, by ritual, by repetition, by that most dangerous human instinct of all, the instinct to normalize what degrades others so long as it reassures oneself. America has done that repeatedly. It normalized the auction block, then the chain gang, then segregation, then exclusion dressed as law, then suspicion dressed as policy, then public suffering dressed as news. Each era announces itself as an improvement because the language becomes more respectable. But respectability is not redemption. A cleaner vocabulary does not mean a cleaner conscience. So the ring must be named for what it was, not a strange entertainment from a vanished South, but a confession that this country did not merely dominate black life. It often required an audience for that domination. It required laughter. It required distance. It required people willing to watch pain and call the evening normal. That is why this story still matters. Not because the exact ritual still exists in the same room with the same blindfolds and the same cheering men, but because the deeper machinery that made it possible has shown a terrifying ability to survive. It survives wherever black suffering is treated as expected, wherever black composure is demanded more than black protection, wherever institutions inherit old assumptions and modernize them instead of uprooting them, and that is where the record must remain sharp. The battle royal did not end when the crowd went home. It entered the bloodstream of the culture. It changed stages. It changed costumes. It learned better manners. But it kept its lesson intact: dominate, display, deny, move on. We should refuse that lesson. Subscribe and comment with your location below and tell me your theory. Did this brutality ever truly disappear, or did it simply learn how to wear a more respectable face? Let the map fill with voices, and let the record show exactly where this truth is still being heard.